Guten Abend, sehr geehrte.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hanna Radziejowska. I'm the director of the Pilecki-Institut in Berlin. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you in the name of the Pilecki-Institut, the Center for Historic Research in Berlin, and the Foundation for German-Polish Cooperation, to this debate on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Our discussion, The Forgotten Ally, Poland on the Fronts of World War II, will be translated into two languages, into German and into English, in order to activate translation. Everybody who's German speaking has to choose Dolmetschen Übersetzen button, and you have to choose the German option. It is on the bottom.
I'm a head of the branch Pilecki-Institut in Berlin, and I would like, on behalf of Pilecki-Institut and Entschuldigung, on, on behalf of Pilecki-Institut Center for Historical Research and Foundation of German-Polish Cooperation, on behalf of these three organizers, welcome all of you to the panel on the 75th anniversary of the end of the World War II, a forgotten ally, Poles on the front of the World War II. Our discussion is translated simultaneously to Polish, English, and German. To turn on the translation, please, all English speakers, click on the interpretation icon and then select the English option. This interpretation icon is located on the bottom bar of the window on the right side of the Q&A chat icon. Szanowni Państwo, dobry wieczór. Nazywam się Hania Radziejowska, jestem kierowniczką Wydziału Instytutu Pileckiego w Berlinie i chciałabym w imieniu trzech organizatorów, czyli Instytutu Pileckiego, Centrum Badań Historycznych Stacji Polskiej Akademii Nauk w Berlinie i Fundacji Polsko-Niemieckiej Współpracy, przywitać się na tej naszej debacie z okazji 75. rocznicy końca II wojny światowej. Zapomniany aliant, Polacy na frontach II wojny światowej, ta debata będzie tłumaczona na trzy języki i drodzy Państwo, żeby włączyć sobie polski język, należy kliknąć włączyć ikonkę Interpretations i tam wybrać język, uwaga, portugalski, niestety nie ma języka polskiego. Ich hoffe, alles funktioniert. Und jetzt,
so I hope everything is working. And now, before we start our discussion, we will have two very short introductory speeches. First, I would like to invite the director of the center, Professor Igor Kakolewski, and pass the floor to him. Igor. So thank you very much, Hania. Ladies and gentlemen, even though in these difficult times we can't organize any live events, we still have technology which makes it possible to jointly commemorate important events. These are events important not only for single nations, but for the entire international community. Without a doubt, the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe is one of those events. Inspired by an important friend of Poland, Mr. Markus Meckel, and thanks to the friendly support of the Foundation for Polish-German Cooperation and the cooperation of two Polish scientific institutions in Berlin, i.e. the Berlin division of the Pilecki-Institut and the Center for Historic Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences, we had the opportunity of organizing this online panel discussion on the topic Poland on the fronts of World War II. This topic is a real challenge for these two scientific institutions in Berlin. It poses us the question, how could we look at this difficult part of German-Polish history and relations? an attempt to take on this challenge was made by the authors and editors of the German-Polish history textbook Europe, Our History, in which the Center for Historical Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences was involved in an important way. In its fourth volume, which will be sold very soon in bookstores, we are trying to show comprehensively how Polish armed forces were involved on the different fronts of World War II. We hope, however, that you will already be able to take a glimpse during today's discussion why the involvement of Polish armed forces is so important within Polish culture of remembrance and why it is so little known outside of Poland. I would like to thank very much Mr. Markus Meckel, the Pilecki-Institut, the Foundation for German-Polish Cooperation, and all those who were ready to break down prejudices and thus made an important contribution to organizing today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to today's discussion. Thank you. Thanks to the director for these introductory words. And thanks that you recalled this important textbook, which is playing an important role for German-Polish relations. The Pilecki-Institut in Berlin is a branch division of the Pilecki-Institut in Warsaw. The director of the both institutions, Dr. Wojciech Kozlowski, will say a few words too. The floor is yours, Wojciech.
My camera was switched off by the host. But you don't have to see me. It's enough that you can hear me. So, distinguished panelists, dear representatives of the host institutions or co-hosting institutions, dearest Berlin team, friends and supporters of the Pilecki-Institut, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion marking the 75th anniversary of the end of war in Europe. The Pilecki-Institut is a research institution based in Warsaw and in Berlin, where our vibrant branch has been in operation for several months and has already become an outstanding platform for continuous scholarly dialogue with German and, more broadly speaking, international academia, as well as an ever more inspiring window on modern Polish history and culture for popular audience. The Institute in Berlin is dedicated to bringing forth Polish source materials, archives, witness accounts, and oral histories that embrace and express the Polish experience of resisting and fighting Nazi and Soviet totalitarian regimes during the Second World War. It's our goal to initiate international research and collaboration, and thus conversation, based on solid historical evidence that fill gaps in mutual understanding and build bridges that draw closer shores of conflicting memories, perspectives, and approaches. I would like to acknowledge our partners, the Center for Historical Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and the Foundation for Polish-German Cooperation. Thank you for your generous support and exemplary cooperation. It's much appreciated. I sincerely hope you will enjoy the discussion and have an inspirational evening. Thank you for your participation.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank.
Thank you. And now I would like to present the first participant, Markus Meckel. He is the chairman of the Board of Trustees Foundation for German-Polish Cooperation. He is the former foreign minister of the GDR. He was an important opposition representative in the times of the GDR. It is important to mention that Mr. Meckel has always been one of the initiators of these panel discussions. The floor is yours, Markus. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank all the partners who already spoke. We couldn't see Cornelius Ochmann and Christoph Rack, the directors of the Foundation for German-Polish Cooperation, who took up our idea and brought us all together here. So thanks to them too. At the beginning, I'd like to take a look at the broader framework. In Germany, we're always talking about the forgotten ally. I think in Germany, almost nobody knows about the role Poland was actually playing in the liberation of Europe from National Socialism. We are in the 30th year of German reunification. For 30 years. Germany and Poland and the neighboring states are not only free, democratic, and independent after the end of the Cold War, but at the same time, this is linked to a new process of getting to know one another. From both sides, we are again and again seeing that we know too little of the other. And we first have to get to know the historical experiences of the other state in order to deal with them. In 2004, it was an important fact when Poland, together with other young democracies, became a member of the European Union. And in the European Parliament, the discussion on history started during the celebrations on the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II. In Germany, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, wasn't seen in its central importance, and especially for Poland, and of course also for the Baltic states. And to this very day, we are finding that there are these differences in perspective. So we have to listen closely and look at the experiences of others. The Second World War, which ended 75 years ago, is, to this very date, a very controversial topic here in Europe. Looking towards Russia, where there will not be the huge parade on the 8th of May, which is the large war from 41 to 45, how they counted, and the first part from 39 to 41 is not present in public knowledge. Russia and the Soviet Union was not a victim, but it was a co-perpetrator with the Hitler-Stalin Pact, with the Baltic states in front of Finland, etc. In the past 2 years, we have seen intense discussions in Poland on World War II. The Tusk government has created the Museum of Second World War in Gdansk, and the director was let go because these questions are very controversial in Poland too. Looking at newspapers in the past days, we've heard Gerhard Schröder talk about Germany's responsibility towards Russia against the backdrop of the crimes of World War II, because the Russian people suffered extremely. But he sadly forgot to mention that this holds true not only for Russia, but also for Ukraine, Belarus, and all the other states which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And all these states have very different perspectives on this history. Poland, and it has been mentioned already, was part of all the armed forces of the Allies. It was part of this war, and the very short war in 1939, of course, but since from then, from 1939 on, it was part of the Allied armies in France and in other parts of the world. we will hear about the Home Army, which wasn't mentioned in school books in the GDR. You could only hear about that in the West, and those who fought in the Home Army in Poland post-45 were under pressure themselves, and the person who gave his name to this institute was actually killed and during communist times. Poles fought with the Red Army. I remember when at the beginning of the 90s, the Polish author Czipiorski, who was part of the Warsaw Uprising and was then interned in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, he told me he was liberated by Polish troops, and it was such a unique thing, a memory for him. He was still moved by this, talking to me in the 90s. Then there is that story nobody knows in Germany, but the Anders Army. We will talk about this too. We know that Stalin, under the name of Katyn, killed more than 20,000 officers of the Polish army. Who wasn't killed was interned in camps. And when Hitler Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they were freed from the camps, and General Anders collected them in the beginning with Stalin's agreement. And then they went via Iran and Palestine back to Europe and participated in the Battle of Monte Cassino in a very special way. In 2014, I was invited by the Polish Minister President to an event where veterans and also very young people, thousands of young Poles, came to Italy to celebrate this important event. And in Germany, we were wondering, what are those Poles doing in Italy in the occasion of the end of World War II? Because it's simply not known in Germany. So it is the aim of this event to make this more known in Germany and to also point out the strong differences also between the Poles who were involved, also the tragical role of Poles during the area of occupation. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were conscripted in the Wehrmacht army and had to fight there, and it was a disaster for them after 1945. They couldn't talk about their own history. So it was a double tragic role they had to play. Many of those deserted, others became prisoners of war, wore another uniform, those of the Western Allies, and fought against Germany. I would have wished that this differentiated view on history, which makes Poland not only a victim, but also an acting party in World War II. It acted to liberate us. They were fighting for independence and freedom. That's what they died for. And I would have wished that at least 75 years after, this would have been a public topic here in Germany, to do something about what Stalin at the time prevented, namely the recognition of Poland as an ally, so that Germany at least should give recognition to Poland for this role. And this is one of the topics of this event. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Markus Meckel, for this inspiring and very personal introduction. Mr. Meckel has given us a glimpse at the context of this debate and mentioned also the historic complexity. We will get back to these topics with our panelists. In a second, we will see a short film which has been made specifically for this panel discussion. We tried to summarize the history of Polish troops on the fronts of World War II, and I have a small thing to point out. This Zoom platform is not suitable for film, so please, in order to watch this film with a good quality, we will just give you the link in the chat. And if it doesn't work, you just use that link if you can't see the video properly here in the Zoom screen.
In September 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland, beginning the deadliest war in history. Despite a series of fierce defensive battles, including in Gdansk, at the Böhler River, and the defense of Warsaw, Poland was defeated in October 1939. The country was taken into occupation, but Poles continued the fight. The government moved first to Paris and then to London. Polish soldiers, seamen and airmen left the occupied territories to form or join Allied divisions, creating the fourth largest Allied army to fight in Europe. Many of those who remained behind organized resistance. The Polish underground state was one of the largest resistance organizations in Europe, providing assistance, gathering intelligence, and carrying out sabotage missions. Żegota, a resistance aid council, helped the Jews in occupied Poland. The Home Army was active throughout the war, numbering over 300,000 soldiers, and its largest operation was in the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944. Jewish fighter groups in Poland were the first in Europe to rise up in arms against Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. Polish mathematicians played a key part in cracking the Enigma code, while secret intelligence agents provided invaluable information. A mine detector invented by a Polish engineer was used to great success at El Alamein. Another Polish engineer hacked the German missile program and managed to smuggle out key components of V-2 ballistic missiles. It was people like Jan Karski and Witold Pilecki that would inform the world of the German atrocities being committed in the camps. Polish divisions were formed in France in as early as autumn 1939. Even after the Battle of Dunkirk and subsequent evacuation of Allied forces to Great Britain, Polish troops joined the French army in continuing to fight the German invaders. In North Africa, Polish soldiers fought side by side with British and Australian regiments in 1941 to defend the city of Tobruk. It was there that German panzer divisions were stopped in open battle for the first time. The defenders did not give up, and the city was eventually relieved by British forces. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, forcing it to switch to the Allied camp. The Sikorski-Maisky Agreement was thus signed to muster an army of 100,000 Polish soldiers, who had been Soviet prisoners and captives in the Gulag. This army made its way through Persia and Palestine, and finally back to Europe. When the Allied forces came to a halt in Italy after a spectacular initial success at Anzio, it was the Polish Second Army Corps that defeated the Germans at Monte Cassino, ending the long siege and opening the way to Rome. It was Polish troops who later liberated Ancona in July 1944 and Bologna in April 1 year later. As the tide of war turned, the Allies prepared to invade German positions in Normandy. D-Day became one of the most recognizable events in the war, and, sure enough, the Poles were there in the Navy and the Air Forces during the beach landing, and in the ground units in the subsequent fighting to trap the German units in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. Afterwards, they went on to liberate Ypres, Ghent and Breda, finally taking the German naval base in Wilhelmshaven in May 1945. When the Allies carried out Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation during the war, the Poles were there, fighting on both sides of the Rhine in September 1944. Polish airmen were in combat the moment the war broke out. They distinguished themselves in 1940 in the Battle of Britain, with the famous Polish 303 fighter squadron taking down more enemy planes than any other. The amazing efforts of the Allied air forces inspired Winston Churchill's famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Polish airmen and airwomen would continue to serve in other parts of the world, not only in Europe, but also in North Africa and Asia, through to D-Day and Normandy, and final defeat of the Third Reich in 1945. Polish bomber squadrons carried out bombing raids until the end of the war. The Polish Navy engaged the enemy throughout the war, escorting convoys, transporting troops, and carrying out patrols. It was the Polish destroyer Piorun that eventually sighted and engaged, along with British destroyers, the German battleship Bismarck during the Battle of the Atlantic, before it was finally sunk by Allied forces the following day. The Polish Navy and troops were there in Narvik when the Allies fought for the strategic cargo port in Norway, and later during the invasion of Italy and D-Day in Normandy. Two Polish armies totaling over 300,000 soldiers fought alongside the Red Army to combat the Germans in the east. When the Allied Red Army entered Berlin in April 1945, Polish troops were there among them, and the white and red Polish flag fluttered over central Berlin, marking the final victory. Thanks to the Allied effort, the war ended on the 8th of May 1945, and Poland was there. And yet, when the Allies met to discuss the New World Order and to celebrate victory over Nazi Germany, Poland was not there. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin decided that Poland would remain under Soviet influence, and the Iron Curtain separated the West from the East for the next 50 years. With 6 million Polish citizens perishing during the war, including 3 million Polish Jews, and over 1 million Polish soldiers fighting on all its fronts, Poland's fate was ultimately decided by others. It was only after 1989 that Poland became a free country again.
Ich danke an den Leiter der kulturellen
Thanks the director of the cultural project of the Pilecki-Institut who prepared this video. And now we are going to continue with the main part of this debate. It is a large honor and a pleasure to me to present the important participants of the panel discussion. Professor Jochen Böhler. He represents the Chair of Eastern European History at Friedrich Schiller University of Jena, and amongst other, he's the author of the book The Invasion, Germany's War Against Poland, and Task Forces in Poland, Representation and Documentation. He worked with Klaus Michael Malmann and Jürgen Mattheus. Dr. Jacek Młynarczyk, he's a historian. He has been a research associate at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun since 2011. He has written many books on Poland's role in the Second World War, amongst them Poland under Soviet and German occupation from 39 to 45. Eastern and Southeastern Europe under the Waffen-SS. He issued this together with Franziska Zaugt, and his current project is a monography on the topic of Treblinka, the history of a German annihilation camp in occupied Poland. We have Professor Alexandra Ritchie. She's a Canadian-American historian with the focus topics Germany, Central and Eastern Europe, and she's also focusing on defense and security issues. She's the author of Faust Metropolis, A History of Berlin. The American Publishers Weekly named it one of the 10 best books of the year. And she also wrote Warsaw 1944, which won the Newsweek Teresa Turanska Prize for the best book of 2014 and the Kazimierz Bujarski Award for the best history book in Poland in 2015. She is a presidential counselor in the National World War II Museum of New Orleans, and she's the governor of the St. Michael's University School in Victoria, Canada. She is the holder of the chair, the Władysław Bartoszewski Chair, and teaches history and international studies at the Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. Poland, as a forgotten ally in a Second World War, this is about more than just the military aspects. If Poland is a forgotten ally, couldn't we also call it a forgotten victorious force, a forgotten winner? So I'd like to ask Dr. Jacek what do these parades, which held place in 45 and 46 in European capitals, do they tell us who was celebrating and what was celebrated in London, in Moscow, in Warsaw? Thank you for the kind introduction. Before I answer, I'd like to thank all the organizers for the invitation. Indeed, we have an interesting situation. After the end of World War II, we have 3 large parades in 3 different European capitals. The first took place in Moscow on the Red Square. It was in 1945 on the 24th of June, so shortly after the end of the war. I'm going to look at these parades from the Polish perspective. This parade was a huge demonstration of the military power of the Soviet Union and its military dominance over the Nazi Germany. And they threw down 200 German flags on the Red Square. So it was the first celebration of victory for the heroes of the war, the Russian heroes of war. From the Polish perspective, it was important insofar as the Polish could participate, so representatives of the Polish communist government and first of all the representatives of the Polish armed forces who used to fight next to the Soviets, so they were invited. It was not a large party, it was only 30 persons, but this parade was mostly about showing the allegiance with Soviet Union from the perspective of the Polish communists. And it was important to show that the weapons of the Soviet Union and the Red Army and allegiance and cooperations also in an ideologic perspective. Polish communists at the end of the war were still a bit controversial. So everybody was celebrating the victory, but Poland was completely changing its political landscape. It used to be a country tied to the West, and now, all at once, it was becoming a country that was more and more communist, and Stalin it was parts of Stalin's structure of countries. So that's the first parade. The second parade is 1 year later in Warsaw. It takes place on the 8th and 9th of May 1946 in Warsaw. The statement of that parade is exactly the same from Polish perspective. That's a very interesting parade because, as I said, the communists were still to hold the decisive elections in 47. And they wanted to show basically the same things. They wanted to make it clear that they show their allegiance with communism and the Red Army, but it was basically a Polish parade. And astonishingly, all those who died on all fronts of the Second World War were named. So also those who died in the Polish armed forces in the West. Very controversial from the Polish perspective is the last parade on the 8th of June 46 in London. And this parade actually took place without any Polish representatives. This is very interesting, and it shows how difficult the Poland's situation in the international community was at the time. We all saw in the film that Poland was one of the largest allies in World War II. Looking at the numbers, the Polish armed forces were about 240,000 at the end of the war. The Polish armed forces in the east were even 290,000 soldiers. And in the underground alone, we had more than 500,000 people in the Home Army and the National Armed Forces and the other battalion. So the Polish armed forces was a huge one, and it was a huge effort made by the Polish nation. And still, they weren't present at the parade in London. We can't say that they weren't invited at all. They were invited. However, the English Prime Minister sent the invitation to Warsaw, to the communist government, and they actually had agreed to come to the parade. Of course, it was linked to the consent of the Soviet Union, but initially they agreed to come. Then, however, when they heard that also representatives from the Polish armed forces in the West were to take part, not as a division, but as single representatives, those who had earned special merits in the Battle of England, when they heard about that, they cancelled. And the Polish fighter pilots who were individually invited to take part with their English colleagues also cancelled because they didn't agree to taking part in a parade where the rest of the Polish armed forces was not to be present. And this shows just how difficult it was for the Western allies to to find an agreement with Poland. The First World War was started to liberate Poland and to keep up Poland as a nation. Poland was liberated from occupation. And in this parade, everything was very controversial. Sorry, I have difficulties hearing him. Thank you very much. Question for Professor Alexandra Ritchie. This parade in London, what does it tell us? Can you tell us about this forgotten ally of World War II from the British perspective?
Well, it's a very interesting and I would say sort of shameful. I mean, every nation in World War II has its victories, heroes, and every nation also has its terrible points. And I would say this is a very low point in British history or Commonwealth history, because the Poles should have been in the parade. And under Tony Blair in the subsequent anniversary celebrations of VE Day, the Poles went to the front of the parade. So there was some sort of attempt at reconciliation. But of course, as was mentioned at the time, it was an extremely difficult situation because the Polish had changed their recognition from the Polish government in exile, based in London, to the Soviet-backed, basically puppet regime, the Provisional Government of National Unity, by February 1945. And so by VE Day, when they were planning for this big celebration, the British government, as was mentioned, initially invited the Soviet-backed government in Poland to send a flag party to represent Poland amongst the Allied forces in the parade, but did not specifically invite the representatives of the Polish forces that had fought under British high command. Now, this is very important to understand that the government had changed in the United Kingdom. This is the Attlee government, no longer Churchill's government. Under Churchill, this would not have happened. But Attlee was very, very keen on trying to kind of maintain links with Stalin and so on. Now, what is not so well known is that Churchill, many figures in the RAF, British figures in the RAF, and a great number of MPs protested that the Poles were not included, seeing it as an affront to the Polish war effort and a moral concession to communist power. There was a great division in the UK at the time between those who were keen on being friendly to Stalin and those who were not. And it was after these complaints that the 25 pilots of the RAF who'd taken part in the Battle of Britain were invited to be part of the parade. And then Foreign Minister Bevin started sending invitations to the Chief of Staff of the Polish Army, General Kapansky, and various others. But because the whole Polish contingent hadn't been invited carte blanche, those individuals who were invited declined to attend. Winston Churchill, as leader of the opposition at the time, said in Parliament that none of the Polish troops, and I must say this, who fought with us on scores of battlefields, who poured out their blood in the common cause, are now not to be allowed to march in the victory parade. And he was very, very sorrowful about this. So, but again, it shows the complexities of post-war, Cold War politics starting to emerge, and the problems that the Attlee government felt. How do we deal with Stalin? And not to forget that there were a great many people in the Labour government after the war in the UK who were very pro-Soviet.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Jochen Böhler, what does the end of the war mean for Germany? How was it discussed? To say it with Weizsäcker's words, the liberation from National Socialism. First of all, hello to everyone. and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. I'm not a professor, I have to say, but I am still, I've still worked a lot with Polish history, and especially during World War II. We started this round with the victory celebration. Of course, Germans are were not present there. They were on the other side. And they were probably looking with fear and anxiousness at what would happen after their total defeat. The end of the war is not seen as the liberation from National Socialism, as Richard Weizsäcker put it in his famous speech at the end of the 80s. So they still didn't have the distance in time. So people who were living through those times initially found it a very terrible defeat, except for those who had suffered from the Third Reich, who were freed from concentration camps and Gestapo prisons. For them, of course, it was a liberation, but we can't forget that the Third Reich was also supported by German population, and they were the losers of Second World War. And as Germany perceived itself as a losing party of World War II, it's always difficult to say how a country, how a population was feeling. But it is clear that immediately after the end of the war in Germany, there was the narrative that the public narrative that the Allied forces had won, and Poles were not present in that narrative because they perceived only the Allies who were in their part of the country. So it was important whether you were on the western part or on the eastern part occupied by Soviet forces. It was a very practical question. And we know that the Allied forces in the West and the East were standing for different global and political models, and everyone had their own opinions on that. Of course, then we had the Nuremberg trials, which created popular opinion in Germany that the winning Allied forces were making everybody in Germany a criminal, so there was quite some critical spirit. It was a contradictory landscape, and it's not surprising that Poland did not play a large role, and that the merits of the Polish armed forces who fought on the Eastern and Western Allies, they are historically undisputed, but in the historic perception in Germany, they are almost unknown to this day, I have to say. So when I address the topic nowadays, outside the circle of military historians who really are experts on the battles of the Second World War, and the interest in military history has receded a lot in Germany after World War II, differently from other countries like Russia, Poland, etc. There's still a large interest in battles and how they went on and which roles different states were playing in them. So it's still a very popular topic, and you can see this in the number of publications on this. In Germany, however, at least in the west of Germany where I grew up, it does not play a significant role any longer. So military history has been completely insignificant for a long time. So the topic has come back to universities. There are some chairs for military history nowadays, but I think Markus was correct in his introductory words that in the GDR and the contribution and then how the contribution of the Allied forces was remembered, that the home army in Poland, this was not mentioned in the GDR either for political reasons. So we have to say that in German remembrance, Poland, as far as I can see, Poland as an ally comes as a surprise for many people, even if they can justly be called an ally, as the film has shown. Thank you very much. Today's political problems with Poland, can't they be? Can the reason for that be that it is difficult to put it in the group of the victims, and it's also difficult to put it in the group of the victorious parties? And I'd like to ask a question to Professor Ritchie and to Jacek Monacz. Andrzej Bukowski, the Polish author, said that those fighting in the Warsaw Uprising were heroes, extreme heroes. Can we say that that not remembering the military contribution goes back to the fact that the ideological sphere, like values and things, were stressed too much, and they weren't talking about hard political facts? Alexandra, Ritchie, please.
Oh, I think that when you're looking specifically at the decision to hold the uprising, when it was held, and so on, yes, there are many criticisms of it. But if you look overall at the Polish contribution to World War II and its importance, I would say that one shouldn't get too bogged down in what turned out to be a disaster militarily and otherwise, and if you look overall at the Polish contribution to World War II and the values that the Poles espoused were quite extraordinary. And so to pull back a little bit from the specifics of the Warsaw Uprising, to look at the incredible decision immediately by Poles as soon as the conflict was imminent, to get the Navy to the United Kingdom, to start an underground organization which was unequaled in Europe. Unbelievable what the AK and also the civilian underground accomplished from universities to help aid for people and so on. The contribution of intelligence, I mean, some of these things were covered in the movie that you showed, but the contribution of intelligence, getting Enigma, getting B1, B2, Jan Karski, and so on. I mean, it's just extraordinary what the Poles did, what they accomplished. And I have a great many acquaintances who fought with Poles. In my grandfather and my great uncle, for example, I landed in Juno Beach in the Normandy landings, and fought with Poles in the liberation of Holland. And I remember a father of a headmaster of mine at school who fought with the Poles, a Pole from the SOE in Norway, and they adored the Poles. They absolutely saw them as incredibly brave, fighting men, absolutely extraordinary, valiant, and so on. So I think that one has to be very careful not to look at one event which turned out to be, I think, a tragedy, a disaster for various reasons, and to negate the other contributions that the Poles made throughout the war, whether it's Monte Cassino, North Africa, liberation of Berlin. I mean, you can really pretty well look at any front and you'll see Poles fighting there.
Vielen Dank, Dr. Jacek Młynarczyk. Kannst du das kommentieren?
Thank you, Jacek. Could you comment, please? Sure. So, in the fight, in war, it is not about heroism, being brave or being cowardly. It is about political aims and implementing them. Looking at the Warsaw Uprising, they decided, it was a military decision, really. It could have made sense in the situation. We are used to looking at the effects of the Warsaw Uprising from today's perspective. And of course, we call it a military defeat. We talk about the number of deaths, and it was unproportionately high. And most of them were civilians. It was 600,000 dead. And Warsaw was destroyed completely. But at the beginning of the uprising, nobody could know that. So the Red Army was almost at the river Weichsel. It was in the outskirts of Warsaw. And people were hoping that through a targeted military operation, you could conquer the heart of Warsaw, and then you would be the one who had won and could hand it over to the Red Army. It was planned for 10 days, but it took months after all. So it was about political goals, and sadly they didn't succeed. It was a part of an operation called Plan Böhler, and the entire plan said that you wanted to be ahead of the Red Army. So they wanted to free different cities and later hand them over to the Soviet army as Polish cities to set a sign to make clear that you were present as Poles having fought for your own freedom. You started talking about political problems with Poland. And it can be difficult to count Poland in the group of victims. I have a problem with that. It doesn't correspond to the facts, because Poland is one of the largest victims of World War II. 1.5 million people, no, many millions of people died, amongst them 3 millions of Polish Jews, and most of the dead were parts of civil society. So Poland was destroyed, it was bombed. The cultural landscape was destroyed. So Poland is one of the largest victims of World War II. There should not be a competition between who is the largest victim, however. It just should be recognized what happened in this terrible war. And Poland is one of the largest victims of World War II. Looking at the perspective whether it is a victor in the sense of ending the German occupation, yes, it can be named a victor, German occupation was ended, but with that came the change of political orientation in Poland. Poland became communist all at once. And this is a fact which was difficult from the Polish perspective. It wasn't a victory for them. It was an enormous defeat. For me, it is one of the largest defeats for Poland in World War II, that we weren't able to be and remain an independent nation. We were forced to go to the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, the wrong side from the Polish perspective. Thank you. I'd like to get back to the German perspective now. And Jochen, you said that there is no large culture of remembrance of the German underground state and Polish soldiers. Could we say that the fight against two totalitarian regimes just yielded too many victims, too much heroism and pathos? Is that the reason why there is no remembrance of that in Germany? Well, I think in Germany we don't have a memorial culture and for that, and it's easy to explain why the Polish contribution on the side of the Allies is not remembered so much in Germany. I think Professor Ritchie made a good point, saying that in the Anglo-Saxon world post-45, the people were quite outraged that the Poles were not remembered because they were fighting side by side with the British forces and with other forces too. So in Germany, the German population, who could have said something about the Polish contribution? That would have been the German soldiers who were fighting against Polish soldiers. So they were seeing them as fighters and leaving out the National Socialist ideology. There's always that kind of soldier's ethical code, respecting your enemy, but tales about Polish fighters and also tales about participating in the war were not told by German soldiers. Those who were in the war only talked about amongst their closest family members, and otherwise they kept silent. So it is difficult to have a discussion about that. I always have to explain why we know so little about all this. One explanation could be that Germany was turning away from military history. We were on the side of the losers, so it was a very different perspective on the contributions of the single Allied forces and the different interests. What I think is important, we mentioned two aspects, and speaking as a German historian and moving away from these two aspects and talking about the Polish contribution independently of how much we know about it in Germany. Professor Ritchie said it's important not to look only at the Warsaw Uprising. Dr. Młynarczyk said it's also important to look at how it went on, the Warsaw Uprising. But I think it's also important to point out to listeners, when we talk about Polish soldiers, Polish fighters, when I ask myself, what is the Warsaw Uprising? What does it mean for me? I think it is the culminating point of a fight of Poles in their own occupied country. So it is a large armed force in occupied Poland, and that armed force had prepared the uprising for many years. It's a Polish army on the occupied Polish territory, and I think it's quite extraordinary in history. And I think it's a pity that little is known about this outside of Poland. And just one last point that was also mentioned in one of the questions, why it is so important to remember this. And the question of how we should look at Poland. Is it a victim or is it a victor? I think no one in this panel round would deny that Poland is one of the countries who suffered most from German occupation in World War II. I think it's rather about the continuing existence of a Polish nation due to the end of the war and the beginning of the Cold War, Poland no longer being an active nation. But I think it's still important to see that there was a Polish exile government in London and Polish armed forces in the west and in the east, and those armed forces were fighting everywhere, and they were fighting right to the last second. The Warsaw Uprising ended in 1944, and 1945 they weren't present at the victory celebrations. Thank you for this interesting contribution, and I'd like to talk about another topic. The use of official armed forces always in the name of a certain state. So our topic today is the non-recognition of the Polish contribution in the victory over the Third Reich. So is it possible that in the dominating historical narrative Poles as a nation, as a society are known, but not as official representatives of an existing nation state, thus not valuing the role of Poland? That's my question for Jochen. Could you answer first? It would make sense if I answered this, because you were mentioning what I was trying to express. I'm very thankful to Markus Meckel for having had the idea of organizing this debate. The initiative was his. It's an important topic, and when I was preparing and we were preparing for the discussion, I think it was clear to us that the continuing existence of the Polish nation in London, not just on paper with the diplomatic notes of protests and the like. No, it was actually a government in exile that could have had an impact if the Allied forces had permitted it. For example, news of the murder of Jews in the camps in Poland, these news were conveyed to the Polish exile government in London, and it was an important contribution from the Polish underground as the armed branch of the exile government, and that was an important contribution. So, but it didn't lead to the desired effect, tragically. So I was just saying, yes, Hanna, it is very important to underline that it wasn't just a symbolic contribution. It took a huge effort and a huge spirit of resistance to keep up this Polish nation outside of the country and inside the country, and fight for it. And this is my personal opinion. I can't give any scientific basis for that, but I do think that the question of the existence of a Polish state often poses a problem in the German-Polish relations. Germans tend to underestimate Poland as a political partner Poland had ceased to exist in the European landscape in the 19th century, so it was kind of seen for some years as a short-lived state, a state incapable of really organizing its own affairs. So these problems go back much farther. And this might be one of the reasons why Poland is underestimated. So it's important to stress that it was a huge achievement of Poland under occupation to keep up that exile government and organize armed forces outside its territory and inside its territory. Thank you, Jochen. You just said that before the war, Poland was seen as a kind of a seasonal state before the war. Alexandra, Ritchie, did this influence Churchill's and Roosevelt's approach?
Well, I think it's very difficult to compare the historical German views of Poland and those of the Western allies. Germany had such a long history with Poland, and even from the Bismarckian or the 123 years of Polish partitions, it was in some ways Germany's self-interest to portray Poles as somehow lesser beings. This fit very much into Hitler's ideology after all. The Western allies had a different view. Those Poles who came to fight as comrades in arms to the British forces, they were under British high command, not American, but they did also cooperate with the Americans too, were treated with great respect. The 40 or so thousand men in uniform were commanded by the British and were treated just as they would have been if, and I can speak as a Canadian because we had 1.1 million men in uniform and women in the Second World War. And we are also one of those small nations that people have forgotten about their contribution to the war. The Canadians don't feel it as keenly. And this is really my point, that the Canadians or the Poles who fought, nobody talks about the Canadian incredible bravery in the Aleutian Islands campaign or in Hong Kong or all these other things. It's irrelevant, because what's relevant to the Polish case is not that the armed forces fought bravely and were integrated into the British High Command. What is important is, in a sense, the betrayal of Poland politically, which meant that these men and women who had fought in Anders' army or had fought with Jacek or Sosabowski ended up as exiles in the UK and treated because of Tehran, because of Yalta, and because of the realities of the end of the war. It was very much a political considerations which led to the Poles being treated as these sort of second-class citizens. But during the war itself, if you talk to any of the soldiers who fought alongside Poles, they commented very often on their bravery, on their dedication and their honor. So this is not a question of the at the time that the Poles in uniform were being treated or being seen to be in some way not as good as the other forces. The problem stemmed from the political realities of Stalin and his coming conflict with the Western Allies. It comes from Tehran, it comes from Yalta, it comes from the fact that the Red Army was occupying Poland and putting the Lublin puppet government in place by the end of 1944.
Danke. Jacek Młynarczyk.
Thank you, Jacek Młynarczyk. This role of Poland, does it still influence remembrance culture? So to call Poland a seasonal state, to differentiate between Poland as a state and as a society, how is this perceived today? It does have a certain importance. During the war, Poland did not have an own nation during occupation. It fought bravely, but right from the outset, Poland could not reach its political goals. After World War II, Poland disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. It was on the wrong side, so to speak, from Western perspective. It was only after the fall of the wall that Poland was trying to come back to Europe. It was at the heart of Europe, of course. Of course, Alexandre, Ritchie is right in pointing out that there was a great camaraderie between, a great partnership between British and Polish soldiers, that they valued each other. But this did have no influence on political decisions. Poland, the large question is, could Poland have done things differently? I think Poland did everything it could at the time. In the occupied country, it was fighting between two overpowering enemies. Then the Polish underground state was created, and trying to help the Allies to find victory. From the perspective of the Allies, I don't know if Poland really was a seasonal state from their perspective. I'm a seasonal state perhaps in the sense that they weren't very keen on keeping the Polish borders intact. The Polish-British allegiance from September 39, it said that only the western border could be guaranteed, and the secret agreement said very clearly that attacks from Germany were there. When we had the Polish exile government in London, during talks in 1940, it was said that they weren't going to fight a war because of the eastern border of Poland. As Jochen Böhler said, the Polish exile government was there. It did play an important role because the state institutions were being kept up, but it was under continuous pressure to find some kind of agreement with the Soviet Union, and this meant that Poland really had to suffer an annexion from the eastern direction. The Allies put pressure on Poland. And later, the enormous military effort was a decisive factor for the Western Allies to fight for Poland's existence as a state, as a nation in the post-war area, but they weren't ready to fight with the Soviet Union, to enter into conflict with them in order to make Poland an independent state in Europe. And this is why they were thinking of changing the national area, national territory to the west, and then the Yalta Conference, etc. All this was looking at keeping Poland on the map somehow, but they didn't give so much importance to the aspect on how Poland was to be on the map. Was it going to be a free country? They did try to do that with Stalin, but Stalin had the better position at the time, and he prevailed with his politics. And he just let facts speak. And actually, from that perspective, Poland being a communist country all of a sudden, and during the Cold War, just being forced to switch sides. And from that, you can explain why they were seen as a difficult ally or a marginal ally. Poland, as a communist state, was not able to have its own culture of remembrance. It had to adhere to the official communist version, and it was not able to create its own historical narrative for decades, almost for half a century. So it may have been present in historical debates, but not as much. It is only now that Poland might rejoin the debate on European remembrance. And we have to make an effort to tell our own story. Thank you, Markus Meckel. Would you like to comment?
Ja, gerne. Ich möchte noch ein paar Bemerkungen dazu machen und bin sehr dankbar für diese Diskussion, die wir haben konnten, weil ja auch viele neue Erkenntnisse, glaube ich, für jeden, der so nicht tief im Thema steckt,
Insights for everybody who's not that deep into the topic.
War vielleicht vorhin ein Missverständnis, wenn ich sagte,
might have been a misunderstanding when I said I would like Poland
das ist völlig klar. Und als solches ist Polen in Deutschland sehr bewusst und anerkannt, dass es eines der großen Völker ist, die furchtbarstes von Deutschland erlitten haben. Aber Polen ist eben nicht nur Opfer, sondern auch Befreier. Und diese Dimension kennt man in Deutschland nicht, und das war heute Thema. Und ich glaube, das müsste auch in der Erinnerungskultur stärker verankert werden. Ich hatte vorgeschlagen, dass bei den Feierlichkeiten auch Polen mit den Alliierten, den offiziellen Alliierten eingeladen wird. Denn Stalin hat nun mal verhindert, dass Polen in dieser Weise anerkannt wurde. Frankreich war beim Abkommen auch nicht dabei, wurde aber von den westlichen Alliierten einbezogen.
France wasn't present at the Potsdam Agreement, but it was invited. Poland was not able to participate. It was just in the wrong position.
Ich denke, wir sollten uns darüber Gedanken machen, wie man heute diese stärker ins Bewusstsein rufen kann. Und da möchte ich an einen Vorschlag erinnern, den ich schon vor Jahren gemacht habe, weil wir in Berlin ein Denkmal haben, das von den beiden kommunistischen Ländern, DDR und Volksrepublik Polen, errichtet worden ist.
By two communist
Denkmal in seiner
countries, the GDR and the People's Republic of Poland. It is quite a strange monument, and it has a great quotation from the Hambach Fest
im 19. Jahrhundert begeistert empfangen worden sind und wo es hieß, für eure und für unsere Freiheit. Es ist für mich heute erstaunlich, dass die beiden kommunistischen Länder dieses Motto aufgenommen haben, aber das ist das Einzige, was man von diesem Denkmal jetzt behalten sollte. Und den Ort, denn irgendwie muss man da, kann man es nicht nur verrotten lassen. Mein Vorschlag ist, lasst uns doch diesen Anteil Polens an der deutschen Freiheits- und Demokratiegeschichte, und da gehört natürlich besonders dieses Mitbefreiersein, Mitalliiertersein dazu, aber eben auch Solidarność. Um auch darauf hinzuweisen und die ganz zentrale Rolle Polens in den 80er Jahren und im Jahr 1989, 90. Lass uns doch dieses Denkmal nutzen, neu gestalten und eine Freiluftausstellung machen, dass diesem Anteil Polens an der deutschen Freiheits- und Demokratiegeschichte Kenntnis gibt und gleichzeitig würdigt und damit ein großes Dankeschön ist gegenüber der polnischen Nation, die uns eben Freiheit gebracht haben und die uns dann nach dem und zum Ende des Kalten Krieges mitgeholfen haben, dass wir gemeinsam Freiheit und Demokratie erringen konnten. Und das, denke ich, ist eine gemeinsame Aufgabe, die auch heute noch bleibt.
Thank you. This is a very good idea. And we do have some time for questions from the audience. You can click on Q&A, questions and answers. So please write your questions in German, in Polish, and in English. And while we're waiting for the questions, I would like to ask one last question. What can we learn from history today? So we've been talking about the culture of remembrance a lot. Can Poland's destiny as the forgotten ally of Europe, can it be a warning for Europe today? Markus Meckel?
Also ich würde nicht Vermahnung reden, sondern ich würde von der Öffnung des Blickes reden, dass wir stärker differenzieren, dass wir genauer hinschauen, dass wir die verschiedenen Akteure in ihrem speziellen Handeln oder auch Erleiden zum Thema machen, dass wir die verschiedensten Opfergruppen, die oft vergessen sind, mit ins Bewusstsein holen. Der Vernichtungskrieg im Osten, die Besatzungszeit, all darüber weiß man in Deutschland kaum etwas. Und zwar nicht nur in Polen, sondern auch dann später in den Ländern der Sowjetunion, wenn es um Belarus, die Ukraine geht, um Russland, überall Millionen Opfer. Millionen, die umgekommen sind, sowjetische Kriegsgefangene, 3 Millionen tote sowjetischer Kriegsgefangene, 1 Million Zivilisten in Leningrad von der Blockade schlichtweg verhungert, und zwar ganz bewusst verhungern gelassen durch die Art der Kriegsführung. All das ist zu wenig bekannt. Die Erinnerung an den Nationalsozialismus ist allzu sehr, glaube ich, begrenzt auf den Holocaust, der natürlich ein absolutes Menschheitsverbrechen ist. Aber es gibt vieles andere, das wir nicht wahrgenommen haben. Und deshalb genauer hinzuschauen, auch die schwierigen Kapitel mit zum Thema machen, die Spannungen zum Thema machen. Ein solches differenziertes Bild ist es, was wir nicht nur zwischen Deutschland und Polen brauchen, sondern im Blick auf ganz Europa, und ich hoffe, dass bis zum 80. Jahrestag des Kriegsendes wir mit solcher Differenzierung, mit der Widersprüchlichkeit der Geschichte an manchen Stellen dann auch besser klarkommen, und das geht nur durch Transparenz, Hinhören und ein dialogisches Erinnern zu entwickeln.
Listening and remembering in dialogue. Thank you. Alexandra, Ritchie, same question for you.
Well, I think that it's tremendously important, and I find it actually very optimistic I've spent many years in Germany and in Poland now, but the changes that are happening in terms of the perception of history, for example, in the United Kingdom, in United States and Canada toward the Polish participation and their subsequent fate after World War II is becoming much better known in popular culture. And part of this, of course, is political. All of a sudden, 1989 happens. Poland becomes part of NATO, part of the European Union. There are many Poles now living in the UK, 800,000 or so. Much more cooperation and interaction. And all of a sudden, one sees these barriers breaking down. And when I first met my husband, who's Polish, in 1986, I remember the sort of comments that I would get, both in Germany and in the United Kingdom. You know, why are you going to Poland? What on earth would you do in Poland? It was sort of shocking and revolutionary. Of course, now Poland is becoming part of the furniture in Europe, and is regaining its place in Central Europe, as had there not been a Second World War, and had there not been a Soviet dominated Iron Curtain for so many decades, it would have had its place, and it would have contributed in a normal way. And unfortunately, it was stagnated. It was unable to do so and suffered terribly because of it. But I see a great many signs in Britain, for example, even with the proposed VE Day celebrations that were supposed to have happened today. Of course, they couldn't, with many Poles participating, commemoration of the 303 squadron, commemoration of so many things that the Poles contributed to. And so there is a real recognition. And as I said, part of this is political. We have a situation where, in a sense, the NATO front line is switching from Germany into Poland. Had the virus not hit us, we would have had some 20,000 more Americans in Poland. And I see it in my own work with the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where I have over 100 visitors, VIPs from the United States, who come to Poland every year to try and learn about the country, to try and learn about the military history, but also learn about where the Americans are stationed now and what its future is. So the landscape between the Anglo-Saxon world and Poland is changing drastically. What I find in Germany, which is ironical because it's a neighbor, is that many of the old, I would even say Bismarckian stereotypes about Poland still persist. And it's it seems very hard to break those down.
Dankeschön.
Thank you. We have two interesting questions by Igor Krolewski. I'm just going to read them out. According to rough estimates in the Polish army, at least 8,000 Germans were fighting in the Polish army in 1939, Germans who had the Polish nationality. What do we know exactly about their contribution in the fights against the Wehrmacht and the Red Army in the first month of the Second World War? Jochen, perhaps you could answer that? Well, here too, as Markus Meckel said, we have to use a finer grid to look at these aspects of history. The history of World War II has been written very much starting from the enemy constellations that had reigned for many decades. So questions like the soldiers in the Polish army who felt like they were Germans because they had German roots, they had been living on German territory before 1918, being German citizens, these gray areas had little place in public perception, and historical research was not that interested in these questions. So I can't really tell you what happened to thousands of soldiers who were fighting on the Polish sides, but really were culturally from German families. What it does show, however, is one of the terrible things in First World War and the Second World War, that this ideology, the extreme nationalism that led to racism, what it does to families, especially families living in border areas. Talking about those Polish soldiers with German roots, we're talking about Upper Silesia and other regions which historically have always been border territories between Germany and Poland. And we tend to forget those territories because we're always saying, well, Germany as a nation occupied Poland. Without forgetting those dimensions, we also have to look at the smaller constellations. It is, of course, important to look at the large picture of nation states. Next to that, there's the individual history of those persons who live through the war. And it's much more differentiated. It cannot be told in black and white, because you always have those people who are open to both sides due to their ethnical roots, and they are between all these fronts. So I would say, as a historian, we should take a closer look at those areas and try and find out more about them, because it hasn't been done so much. So interesting question. Thank you. Second question. Why are the estimates on Poles in the Wehrmacht why are they so inaccurate? It says more than 22,000 up to 400,000. Out of those, between 83 to 89,000 just did desert the army. They were captured, and then they fought with the Polish armed forces in the West. What do we know about the destinies of the families of those soldiers and the German occupation, and on what happened to them after World War II? Jacek. Well, I never personally looked at these topics. The problem in estimating the number of Poles in the Wehrmacht, and Poles fighting in the German army, for example, in the SS, etc. Problem is that they were not enrolled as Poles in those units. They were seen as German nationals. The German list of German nationals was compiled in a different way. So the list of ethnic Germans. So they were, it was difficult to differentiate between ethnic Germans, Poles, and Germans. The largest difficulties are presented by constructions like the Kashubians, the Silesians, etc., to say how they felt and which country they wanted to belong to. And talking about almost 90,000 who deserted, it shows that they didn't feel particularly German. Those Silesians did not feel German, and the church, however, the church encouraged them to become Germans, but it didn't mean that they really felt to be German, so they deserted at the first opportunity that presented itself. And many of them later arrived in Great Britain and became part of the Polish armed forces in the West. The destiny of the families of soldiers. I have to say, I'm afraid I can't answer this question. But I'm not aware of huge repressions. So it seems that there is still a lot of research to be done. Oh, sorry, one thing perhaps. So in these situations, how was it done? First of all, you suppose that the families are ethnic German families because the soldiers were ethnic German soldiers. And the result was that they didn't face oppression in the sense that they were thrown into prison, but they maybe faced financial problems because their breadwinner was missing. He couldn't work. He was a soldier, and they did not receive financial support. So that was a kind of discrimination I am aware of, but I'm not aware of any other specific aspects. Thank you. Again, the question, Jacek, are Poles not to blame themselves for not being perceived in their contribution? For 50 years, the Polish armed forces in the West were not mentioned, and after the fall of the wall, this was something people kept silent about. And I think it's a scandal that this has not been mentioned. How can we ask of others to remember the contribution if we can't even agree in Poland that we should respect both armies? It was really a coincidence that decided which army you became part of. Alexandra, perhaps you could answer that question.
Well, yes, just coming back to the discussion just before about the Poles who served in the Wehrmacht or Germans who were conscripted into the Polish army. In a way, in 1939, the beginning of the conflict had, in some senses, almost like a civil war. It's reminiscent of what happened at the beginning of the First World War, when you had Poles fighting in the Austrian or Russian or German armies as well. I mean, this is the complexity of a part of the world like this, with different ethnic groups and nationalities, and particularly because of the border changes after Versailles. You had a German minority that was all of a sudden in Polish territory, and there are many, many examples of reluctant soldiers, people who were conscripted. In war, there are always these gray areas, but it's particularly true of this part of the world. And I know a number of extraordinary stories, including a friend of mine whose father was Jewish and fought in the Wehrmacht and was protected by his fellow Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front so that his identity wouldn't be known. So in wartime, there's so many different layers and gray areas and complexities which happen. In terms of the recognition of the Poles after the war, well, again, I think that it's in a way one has to look at the history. I mean, if you look at something like the AK, the Polish Home Army, from 1944, especially July 44 to July 45, was a time of extraordinary repression against the members of the Polish Home Army by the Soviets. And tens of thousands were arrested, sent to the Gulag, some were killed, imprisoned. And my father-in-law included, who spent 7 years in the Stalinist prison, with the added insult of having to spend time in prison with former Nazi criminals, including Jürgen Stroop and Höss. So this was a sort of humiliation of the AK, trying to, again, to destroy the memory of what the Poles had tried to and had accomplished during World War II. That ends in 1989. Of course, in amongst families and very quietly, privately, people kept this history alive, but it wasn't public, it wasn't accepted publicly. And so it's understandable in a way how within Poland itself, if you've got decades of official repression, you encourage all of the stories. Not all stories in Poland are positive and heroic. There were many things that were dreadful that were done here as well, like in every country. And those things were, all that was just repressed. So you were looking really at a kind of normalization of historiography from 1989 onwards. And of course, it does take time.
Dankeschön. Und vielleicht,
thank you. Perhaps to respond to Jacek Klepios, would someone add a comment? Jochen, please. Yes, while I can't say many new things, Professor Ritchie mentioned a lot of facts. I think it's a good question. As a historian, I think as historians, we learn quite early on that easy answers often cannot be found. Truth and things that happened are oftentimes much more complex than they are being told in publicly or not being told according to the political situation. And I think if we look at the topic of today's discussion, that the Polish contribution to the war is being looked at properly if you look at both sides. Maybe repressing Poland's contribution might be linked to everything being forgotten what was done in the West and in Poland, where you were part of the Soviet world. You always had difficulties looking into Poland's role in the Eastern Bloc. I think the only way to go forward is to seriously work on these things. There is some research going on, but these things take time till they actually are being publicly discussed. I think it would be important to say clearly that things are not as simple and straightforward as they seem when you listen to propaganda. When we were discussing national allegiances and who was fighting for which country in which armed forces, if you zoom closer, it gets more and more complicated, but not less interesting. So often you can't give simple answers, yes or no. We already said a few words on this, but Mr. Kowalski has a question. Are there any serious studies on Polish citizens of German origin? How did they act? What were their aims? How was their commitment? Or were they only seen as the fifth column? Who would like to answer? In historians are quite clear. The focus in Eastern and Western history is very much on those parts of the German minority living on the Polish territory, the so-called ethnic Germans in Polish territory. And the research on the World War II was looking mainly at the question of to what extent did they help German occupators to commit their crimes. This is not without a reason, because parts of the German minority were had been mobilized as of September 39, and they actively participated in murdering their Polish neighbors. This is one aspect, which is very brutal and very radical, and it has characterized almost the entire picture of the ethnic Germans in Poland. But of course, you can't say that all of the German minority in Poland was in the service of the German occupying force, actively participating in persecuting and murdering their neighbors. This is just not true. So we also have to say, when you talk about self-protection of ethnic Germans, that was a radical militia actively participating in the murders of September 39. Of course, they are important because without their help, the German police forces that had come from Germany to Poland wouldn't have been able to murder as effectively because, of course, those ethnic Germans living in Poland knew everybody and they knew their neighbors, so they helped them. But you also have to say that they were not the majority of the ethnic Germans in Poland. So it is important to name this, but we can't say that there was no different behavior of ethnic Germans in Poland. And on this and on the ethnic Germans in the Polish army, almost no research has been done. I maybe might comment, my great-grandmother was declined to sign this list. So there are different families, there are different stories. We have another comment. My ancestors were living as ethnic Germans and a river war near Brest, and the absurd thing about the constellation was that the men who were young enough in 1939 were fighting in the Polish army in Poland, and later those same men were conscripted into the Wehrmacht. We were mentioning this before. I can't say many more questions. It's rather late too, so perhaps we should come to a close. So, no, we have one question left. Manfred Mack is asking, wouldn't it be good to have the project of a Polish monument with the components, one monument at Anhalter Bahnhof station, a documentation center, and political education? Wouldn't that be good to make this more known in the German population? Shouldn't that be supported? Perhaps Markus Meckel, you could say a few words on this.
Ich gehöre zu denen, die gegenüber einem solchen Denkmal sehr skeptisch sind. Weil es zwar richtig ist und überhaupt keine Frage, dass wir viel mehr wissen und informieren sollten darüber, was in Polen nicht nur in den Wochen des Krieges am Anfang, sondern in der Besatzungszeit geschehen ist mit den Millionen Toten. Aber dies ist dann durchaus in sehr engem Zusammenhang zu sehen, was dann nach dem Überfall auf die Sowjetunion in Belarus, in der Ukraine, in Russland geschieht, in den Staaten der Sowjetunion und mit den Völkern. Da gibt es mehr Ähnlichkeiten als Unterschiede und ich glaube, es wäre wichtig, dass wir diese Geschichte im Zusammenhang miteinander betrachten. Ich denke, dass es deshalb trete ich selber dafür ein, dass wir ein Dokumentationszentrum schaffen. Denkmale informieren nicht so gut, sondern wenn wir ein Dokumentationszentrum schaffen über Krieg und Besatzungszeit in Europa, dann wird auch der Unterschied deutlich, wie im Westeuropa gekämpft wurde und im Osteuropa, wie ein Vernichtungskrieg wirklich von Anfang an darauf angelegt war, die Nationen und ihre Eliten zu zerstören, die sogenannten Slawen zu Sklavenvölkern zu machen, wie darauf angelegt wurde, dass aus den Ressourcen des Landes die Wehrmacht ernährt wird und man von Anfang an damit eingeplant hat, dass Millionen von Toten einfach durch Verhungern entstehen. Ich sprach schon von den 3 Millionen Kriegsgefangenen, den sowjetischen Kriegsgefangenen, aber auch der Anteil der Toten der polnischen Kriegsgefangenen ist sehr hoch. Dies alles, wie ich finde, gehört zusammen und deshalb bin ich sehr skeptisch, wenn wir anfangen, angefangen in Deutschland der Opfer des Nationalsozialismus nach Nationen getrennt zu erinnern und zu bedenken. Irgendwann kommen wir dann zu der zynischen Frage, Opfer in Millionenhöhe da sein müssen, damit man ihnen ein Denkmal in Deutschland gibt. Und diese Frage möchte ich dann doch lieber nicht beantworten müssen. Deshalb glaube ich, es ist gut, wenn wir in Deutschland grenzüberschreitend integriert an diese furchtbare Zeit erinnern und das in engem Dialog mit den Völkern, die selber Opfer dieser Entwicklung waren oder eben, wie im Falle Polens, uns gleichzeitig auch befreit haben.
Victims, or who in the case of Poland also liberated us. Jochen, would you like to say something? We have discussed this amongst ourselves, Markus, Meckel, oftentimes. I do understand your point. I think sometimes it is difficult to say, well, one thing is perfect and the other thing can't be done at all. It is always difficult. And the largest difficulty for me in looking at your point at proposing a larger structure for commemorizing the victims of the war, I always stress that it started as early as 39. It was a pre-stage for what came after 41. I think we are on the same side here, so we shouldn't continue this debate here. But I do have a problem with what do we do with the area between 39 and 41, when the later victims in the Soviet Union are not mentioned here. But I do understand your point, Mr. Meckel. I just wanted to say that there are different arguments. We should keep in constructive dialogue on this. And I'm happy that we were able to mention this topic today. And I do understand what you are trying to say. And I think we will continue this dialogue long term, because I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying. And I hope we can find a direction that suits us both. Thank you. We still have two questions. One from Richard Herzinger. The question is, how large do you think is the danger emanating from Putin's revisionist attacks to Poland and the way Putin is trying to manipulate remembrance in Europe, trying to split Europe? What do you think about the reactions of the Western governments? Alexandra, Ritchie, could you answer that?
Yeah, well, I think that what Putin is trying to do is despicable. I think that trying to blame Poles for the outbreak of the war and all the sorts of things he's saying are just part of a larger political game, which he's been playing on various fronts, whether it's cybersecurity to Crimea to trying to disrupt unity in Europe and many other things. It's a very dangerous game. In terms of reaction, what we can do is continue to do research and be absolutely transparent and open and truthful and honest and document our sources and write about history and do films and things like this and so on, where there's open discussion, debate, a dialogue, differing points of view, and where scholars, but also lay people, filmmakers, writers, journalists can contribute to the debate in an open way, which is absolutely precisely the democracy for which the Western allies were fighting for, and is completely contravening the ideas that are perpetrated by this sort of attack against historical truth.
Dankeschön. Möchte noch jemand?
Thank you. Anybody else who'd like to say something?
Also ich will vielleicht doch auch nochmal darauf hinweisen, dass das nicht neu ist. Es richtet sich auch nicht nur gegen Polen, wenn wir daran erinnern, den Denkmalstreit in Estland, den wir vor vielen Jahren hatten, oder auch die Versuche jetzt in der Tschechischen Republik, sich in solchen Fragen des Erinnerns einzumischen, dann brauchen diese betroffenen Länder wirklich unsere Solidarität und auch unsere erhobene Stimme. Und die wünsche ich mir manchmal deutlicher und lauter, als es zurzeit geschieht.
Louder than it often is nowadays. Natalie Kaiser asked, what happened to the Polish resistance fighters who were sent back to Poland after the war? Officially, they were deemed opponents of the regime in socialist Poland. Jacek. It was different, but more or less most of them were facing some repression. They were deemed opponents of the regime. They were persecuted. Often they were sent to prison. In the worst cases, they were even condemned due to espionage. And some of them were even executed due to that. So they had difficult times. Some had the possibility granted from the Polish state to integrate into society, but all of them were facing that kind of state terror. And many of our Western listeners don't know that in the Stalinist era alone, in Poland, about 50,000 members of the Polish resistance organizations were killed. They were victims of Stalinism. They were tortured to death sometimes. Sometimes they were just convicted of collaboration or treason. And there were moments where only the fact that you were part of the Home Army was enough proof, seen as enough proof that you were fascist. And people were convicted to years of prison, or they were simply shot. And they were not only killed, and then they were buried in unmarked graves. And we have a large initiative in Poland going on now for finding those mass graves of those heroes. You have to call them heroes. Finding those graves and giving them a proper burial. So it was there were hard times for them. Thank you. The last question, perhaps on a more optimistic note, Agnieszka Maszowa writes, I'm a Polish person, been living in Berlin for 10 years, and I am gaining very much the impression that the political perspective on Poland has changed for the better. And this is also true for the topics that were discussed today. Do you share my impression? Markus, Meckel, perhaps, and Jochen? Markus, you need to activate your microphone.
Vielleicht nehmen wir diese positive
Perhaps
Äußerung
we
als
could take this
Schlusspunkt,
positive statement as a
dass wir
concluding
heute ein solches Thema auch
comment.
aufgegriffen haben, das sonst in Deutschland
We are
wenig
talking
behandelt
about a
wird,
topic today which
in der
is
Hoffnung, dass
not
wir auch
much
in
spoken
Zukunft
of in Germany,
noch sehr
and
viel
let's hope
differenzierter,
that
wie
we
Jochen
will
Böhler es
have a
gesagt
much
hat,
more
auch
differentiated
Details anschauen und nicht
look at
versuchen, alles nach einem
details,
festgelegten
not
Modus zu betrachten, sondern
using
auf die konkreten
a
Erfahrungen
predefined
schauen,
mode
die
for
Erfahrungen der
looking at
Menschen
things.
ernst nehmen
Instead,
und besser
looking at
aufeinander
individual
hören, um
experiences,
dann für das
taking
einzutreten, wofür wir
seriously
hier
the
heute gemeinsam
experiences of
stehen. Und das
single
sind
people and
die
standing
Werte,
up
die
for
im
our
Lissabonner
joint
Vertrag oder
values,
eben in der
namely those
Europäischen
laid down in
Grundwertecharta
the Lisbon Treaty,
festgelegt sind.
i.e. in
Dies
the
ist doch
European
die Lehre aus
Charter
den
of Basic
Schrecken des
Rights. I
Zweiten
think this is the
Weltkrieges.
lesson
Ich würde
learned
die
from
Europäische
the
Union, die gestaltgewordene
World War
Lehre
II.
aus diesen
I think
furchtbaren
this is
Erfahrungen des
the
20.
lesson
Jahrhunderts
the
bezeichnen.
European Union.
Hier haben
The
wir
European
große
Union is
gemeinsame
really
Verantwortung.
the lesson of the World War II taking shape. So thank you very much. And now, finally, I'd like to invite you to a seminar on the 14th of May at 6 p.m. at Pariser Platz. The event's topic is on the traces of Otto Wächter, remembrance and justice after the war, 50 years later. We have an important human rights lawyer and an author of a BBC podcast, Professor Finn Sons, and the known actor Katja Rehmann will join us. In the name of the Pilecki-Institut, I would like to recommend you to regularly take a look at our social media offer, for example, our podcast series found in the archives and many other things. I'd like to thank all participants of the panel discussion. I'd like to thank the organizers. I'd like to thank the Center for Historic Research in Berlin and the Foundation for German-Polish Cooperation. I'd like to thank Markus Meckel, who initiated today's event. I'd like to thank Professor Makolewski, Cornelius Hochmann, and Carolina Surman for the good cooperation. Extend a welcome to my deputy, Mateusz Kukowski, and the entire team who contributed to organizing today's debate. I'd like to thank Marek Kowalczyk, the producer of the event, and I'd like to thank the translator Karolina Golimowska and Gisela Tanch. I'd like to thank Patrick Schoskav and Marcina Biroric for the wonderful film we saw, and last but not least, I would like to thank all of you for showing up in such large numbers and for asking those interesting questions. I wish you a wonderful evening and stay safe and healthy. Thank you very much.